Right, it's 5:30. I'm going to kick off because, quite frankly, we've paid for it, so we might as well, right? So, thank you. The good news is, unfortunately, the crowd being small, is that it's going to be quite intimate. The downside is, I guess, for you, is that now emotionally you can't get up and walk off, okay? You're here for the duration. So my name's Sam. I lead our alliance business between our business, Nasuni, and Microsoft across Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And today, the objective is to talk about a customer of ours called SDL. Okay, so to kind of kick things off, you're going, that sounds great, Sam. Well, who the hell are Nasuni and what do you do? Fundamentally, we're in the business of decoupling businesses from their data center and helping them on their cloud journey. We're moving their files from their storage infrastructure up into the cloud. Azure, the nice one to kind of focus in on there. And we do this across the world, across all different sorts of companies, various different sizes, but they generally have a number of things in common. One, they're distributed by nature. They don't have one or two locations, although we have customers that certainly do. They generally are spread across the world or the regions, and especially now with work from home, work from anywhere, users can literally be in thousands of different locations. The other aspect is that they generally are having quite significant amounts of data and data growth in the unstructured kind because of the applications that they're generally using. So whether they are Honeywells of the world working on design CAD applications, whether you're SDL, language translation services, etc. That's where we're fitting within the market. And then we go, okay, well, Microsoft do things like that already, so how do we break this down? And I guess if you look at the bottom of the screen there, there's lots of different types of file infrastructure areas, from home directories all the way up to high-performance computing. And yes, Microsoft do have technologies like OneDrive and Teams and SharePoint that are great for organizations of any size, from the smallest to the largest, but they do have some limitations in the type of files that they're going to be looking at and working with. They also have in-house tools like Azure Files, and that is great for certain workloads, but there are definitely some scale limitations there, and that does influence the type of organizations generally that are going to be using that service. And the same can definitely be said for A&F on the high-performance side of things. Where Nasuni fits is around all of this. Yes, there's some crossover, but generally the bulk of the customers that work in partnership with us and Microsoft are in that big white space. Around 80% of the workloads that exists there today. So SDL then, who are they? If you haven't heard of them, they're a language translation services. They're one of the largest in the world. They have thousands of people on their books, but they have 1,500 that are actual translators, and they're native, they're in country, they're literally everywhere. And they are generating huge amounts of data. They pride themselves on the competitive difference on SLA. Within 15 minutes, they want documents and things translated and back for revision within their customers. And therefore, that's actually evolved into a 3-stage process of their cloud transformation. They were not using any Azure 4 years ago. Now they're very big consumers of it. So we've broken these down in hindsight in terms of that journey for them. One was identity workflows. How do we actually increase the way data moves around our business? Second was around business continuity. And lastly was all around centralization of that as well. You're going to stand me up, aren't you? Anyway. So, if we focus in on phase one, no, you're all good, you're all good. If we focus on phase one, now, part of the problem they had is that at any one time, they could have 18 copies of the same data spread all around the world. And that means that each language actually has its own data set. It's incredibly complex to move this efficiently to the translators and back again. Add in the complexity of if the customers come back and said, actually, I need a change on that content, can you help me do this? You end up with version conflict, change control, very difficult to distribute around, and therefore they were running into problems where they were missing their 15-minute SLAs. Now, that's how they've marketed their business in terms of competitiveness. That was a real big problem for them. So what are we looking at? We're looking at the bulk of the data workloads, those volumes in the middle there. They're not the home directories, they're not the high performance, they're kind of everything else. That's the issue we're solving. And most of the time when we walk into an organization, it looks something similar to this. There's technology all over the place. They're locked in with various different skill sets, various different procurement cycles, various different logos. And it creates a lot of complexity, it creates a lot of rigidity that they just can't get out. And then multiply that across all the different types of physical locations they have across the world. It runs into significant problems. We here at Nasuni are all about breaking down and decoupling from the data center, helping that transition to cloud. Why is it complicated? Two areas generally. One, because if you move data away from the user, you're introducing latency. That's a problem that degrades user experience. Two, once data's in the cloud, if we're accessing it directly, we introduce egress cost. We don't want that either because that's unpredictable. So we address those two areas. What we're here to do is to leverage object storage. Now, so when we say cloud, we mean object, a blob, and build a centralized single source of truth global file system that has no limits around scale, from files, from volumes, from users to locations. And then we just hang off all of those, the actual edges themselves, the locations themselves. So we don't have limitations, whether you are one location, 10 locations, 100,000 locations. And the edge on the caching on the edge acts as basically a mask between user and the cloud, reducing latency, and 98% of the time, the data will already be there. We're creatures of habit. We're working on the same files. And that means it controls egress cost as well, significantly. So from SDL's perspective, a user in one location moving to a separate one and sharing content is very, very quick. It's very cheap. We're only sharing the deltas, and therefore allowing them to continually offer up that 15-minute SLA. Phase two, obviously COVID, a very recent memory for most of us, but in terms of how that impacted us on a business level was quite critical. People were literally sent home overnight, and it did cripple many businesses that didn't have something in place that enabled them and their users and workers to carry on business as usual. SDL looked into things like workspaces, Azure Virtual Desktop, things like that. But because they already had Nasuni in place, it was very easy for them to migrate those users, leveraging VDI technologies to make that transition very seamless and very, very effective to them. You're all good, mate, no worries. And from that, what that meant is that they could completely transform the way their users were interacting with the data, carrying on business as usual, most importantly without downtime, which otherwise they would have needed to implement. That's fundamental for keeping their business online, operational, and more importantly, competitive during one of the most significant piece of disruption in our business history, I guess. And a quick quote from the head of SDL. So literally over a weekend, they were able to deploy and enable 1,500 of their most essential translators across the world. And then lastly, on the back of this, they've looked at this and said, well, we're able to now enable our users to work from anywhere. It's not just work from home, it literally is work from anywhere. They could be in the office, they could be at home. We don't know where they're going to be, but we want to make sure they're able to be as productive as possible. So do we actually have a requirement anymore for the physical overhead of real estate? They're now looking at this to say, can we take this technology further to drive other gains within our business and actually take overhead out in terms of the real estate costs that they have in their business? So it's not just an impact directly to IT, it's not just an impact in terms of from an operational perspective, but physically taking out costs to the overall business, which drives greater return on their investment. So when we look at this, we say 4 years ago, they had nothing to do with cloud whatsoever. Since then, they've enabled their business to remain extremely competitive, regardless of where in the world their users are, delivering the expectations that they've come to expect from the SLAs that they offer to the market, to keep them the language translation service of choice. And they've also been able to give their users the opportunity to work literally wherever they want, and at the same time, reduce significant unnecessary costs to their business. So the summary then, in terms of the typical organization that we would work with and that we enable, are looking for things like unlimited storage on demand. We don't know what's around the corner. Hopefully it's not another pandemic, but you can literally be flexible to scale up, scale down as required, not have the overhead and worry about how we actually enable the users and make sure the resources are in the right place. It's a cloud journey, making sure we're breaking down those barriers to entry in terms of moving some of these more complex workloads to the cloud. definitely enabling the users to accelerate the collaboration between an increasingly distributed workforce, wherever they are, between Los Angeles and New York and Auckland and Munich. It really doesn't matter anymore. It feels like we're all in the same office. And I won't read all of them, but fundamentally they started with us at 50 terabytes. They're now using us for just under 2 petabytes. That's the value that we've been able to deliver to their business. And by collapsing other technologies around that they were delivering before, around backup, archive, replication tools, that's generally paid for this investment themselves. That's kept them as one of the market-leading businesses within their sector. So with that, I'm going to wrap this up and wish you all a very pleasant afternoon.
Yeah.